The fluorescent lights of the upscale Manhattan restaurant cast a warm glow over crystal glasses and designer handbags. But 7-year-old Emma sat in the corner, Booth wearing shoes too, sizes too small and a coat she'd outgrown last winter. Her mother, Maria, worked double shifts as a waitress here, and tonight's childcare had fallen through again. Emma knew the rules. Stay quiet, stay invisible, don't bother the customers. She clutched her worn library book and tried to disappear into the leather seat, pretending the rumble in her stomach was just nervousness. At the table nearest to her sat Richard Morrison, CEO of Morrison Tech Industries, a man whose net worth could feed a small country. His salt and pepper hair was immaculately styled, his watch cost more than most people's cars, and his expression held the perpetual calculation of someone always counting profits. He was deep in conversation with potential investors when his phone began to ring. Without glancing at the screen, he silenced it with an irritated swipe. It rang again, and again. "Excuse me," he muttered, finally answering with barely concealed annoyance. "Morrison here." The voice on the other end spoke rapidly in German, frantic and desperate. Richard's face went blank. He'd studied German in college decades ago, but retained almost nothing. The caller seemed to be crying, their words tumbling over each other in panic. "I'm sorry. I don't understand German well enough," Richard said, frustration creeping into his voice. "Can you speak English?" But the caller either couldn't or wouldn't switch languages. The desperation in their voice only intensified. Richard looked around helplessly, catching the attention of his assistant across the room, who shook her head equally lost. He was about to hang up when a small, tentative voice spoke up. "Excuse me, sir. I speak German." Richard turned to see Emma standing beside his table, her eyes wide but determined. She was thin, her clothes clearly hand-me-downs, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. For a moment, he simply stared at this child who had materialized from nowhere. "You speak German?" he asked skeptically. "Yes, sir. My grandmother taught me before she passed away. She was from Austria." Something in the caller's voice had grown even more desperate. Richard made a split-second decision and handed Emma the phone. She took it carefully with both hands, as if it were made of glass. "Hallo? Ja, ich kann Ihnen helfen," Emma said softly into the phone, her German fluent and gentle. For the next several minutes, everyone in Richard's party watched as this little girl conducted an entire conversation in flawless German, her expression growing increasingly concerned. She asked questions, listened intently, and occasionally nodded even though the caller couldn't see her. Richard found himself leaning forward, studying this child who had appeared like an angel exactly when needed. Finally, Emma handed the phone back to Richard. "Sir, that was a Mrs. Schneider from Frankfurt. She's your late mother's childhood friend. She's been trying to reach you for 2 days. Your mother left something for you in Mrs. Schneider's care before she passed away last year. But Mrs. Schneider just found out she has cancer and doesn't have much time. She wanted to make sure you received your mother's letter before it was too late. She doesn't speak English well and was too upset to think clearly. She wants you to call her back tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Frankfurt time, and she'll have her grandson translate." Richard felt the air leave his lungs. His mother had died 14 months ago, and their relationship had been complicated, strained by his obsession with work and success. He'd always meant to slow down, to visit more, to actually talk to her instead of just sending money and expensive gifts. Now this stranger, this friend of his mother's he'd never heard of, had a letter for him, a final message. He'd almost missed because he couldn't understand a desperate woman's German. He looked at Emma with new eyes. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Emma Martinez, sir. My mom works here. I'm really sorry I interrupted. I just heard the lady crying and thought maybe I could help." "Your mother works here?" Richard glanced around until he spotted Maria, who was watching the interaction with a mixture of pride and terror that her daughter had bothered a customer. He gestured for her to come over. Maria approached, wringing her hands. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Morrison. Emma, I told you not to bother the guests." "Sir, please, I apologize." "Don't apologize," Richard said, his voice unexpectedly soft. "Your daughter just helped me in a way I can't begin to explain. She speaks perfect German." "Where did she learn?" Maria's eyes filled with tears. "My mother, sir." She raised Emma while I worked. Emma was her whole world. When Mama got sick last year, Emma would read to her in German, sing her Austrian songs. Mama passed 6 months ago. Richard noticed Emma's eyes glistening at the mention of her grandmother. This child had recently lost someone precious, yet she'd still stepped forward to help a stranger in need. He thought of his own mother, of all the calls he'd ignored, all the visits he'd postponed. "How old are you, Emma?" he asked. 7 3/4, sir. "And what do you want to be when you grow up?" Emma's face brightened despite her sadness. "A translator for the United Nations. I want to help people understand each other. Grandma always said that language connects hearts." Something shifted in Richard's chest, some door he'd kept locked for decades. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card, then wrote something on the back. "Maria, I'd like to talk to you about Emma's education." Maria looked down. "Public School 118, sir. It's a good school." "I'm sure it is," Richard said carefully. "But I'd like to discuss a scholarship opportunity. My company has a program for exceptional young people. Emma's gift for languages, her kindness, her courage to speak up when she saw someone in need. These are exactly the qualities we look for." Over the next hour, as Maria finished her shift, Richard learned their story. Maria's husband had left when Emma was 2. They lived in a cramped, one-bedroom apartment in the Bronx. Maria worked 3 jobs, yet they barely scraped by. Emma attended school, went to the free after-school program, and spent evenings at the library or here at the restaurant, staying out of the way while her mother worked. Despite everything, Emma was a straight-A student who devoured books in 3 languages: English, Spanish, and German. "Mr. Morrison," Maria said hesitantly, "I appreciate your interest, but we can't afford any private school, even with a scholarship. The uniforms, the supplies, the transportation—" "It would be a full scholarship," Richard interrupted. "Everything included. And I mean everything. I'd also like to offer you a position at Morrison Tech." "Maria, we need someone to oversee our corporate dining services. Better hours, better pay, benefits that include full health care coverage." Maria began to cry. Emma wrapped her arms around her mother, her own eyes bright with tears. That night, Richard called Mrs. Schneider's number and left a message, promising to call at the appointed time. He couldn't sleep thinking about Emma's words. Language connects hearts. His mother had tried to connect with him for years, but he'd been too busy, too important, too focused on building an empire. The next morning, with Mrs. Schneider's grandson translating, Richard learned that his mother's letter contained no recriminations, no anger about his absence. Instead, she'd written about her pride in his accomplishments, her understanding of his drive, and her hope that he would someday find the same joy in connecting with people that he found in building companies. She'd enclosed a photo of young Richard with her own mother, his grandmother, both of them laughing in a park somewhere. On the back, in his mother's handwriting, "Remember when success meant having time for love." Tears streamed down Richard's face as he thanked Mrs. Schneider and promised to visit her soon, to hear stories about his mother's childhood, to connect these threads before they were lost forever. True to his word, Richard established the Morrison Humanitarian Scholarship, beginning with Emma as its first recipient. But more than that, he began to change. He started mentoring students, learning their names, hearing their stories. He reduced his working hours and actually attended the charity events his company sponsored, instead of just funding them. He learned that Emma wasn't just gifted in languages. 5 years later, 12-year-old Emma stood before the United Nations building on a school trip, her eyes shining with dreams Richard had helped keep alive. She turned to him, this unlikely mentor who'd become like family, and said in German, "Danke, dass Sie zugehört haben. Thank you for listening." And Richard Morrison, who'd built a technology empire but nearly missed his mother's final message, who'd almost ignored a desperate woman's call for help, replied in his slowly improving German, "Thank you for teaching me that. The most important, connections aren't made in boardrooms. They're made in moments of unexpected kindness. Sometimes angels appear in upscale restaurants wearing 2 small shoes. Sometimes they speak German. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, they remind us that humanity isn't a business transaction. It's the whole point of living.